Hitting the Road is proudly sponsored by...
Some bears spend a lot of time preparing their dens for winter. Others just unpack, settle in, and snooze. Learn more about Sleepy Bear's story at travellodge.com.
As well as contributions from G.E. Johnson Construction Company, Charles J. Murphy, Grayline of Colorado, Laura and Brian Markovich, Elham and Edward Ketchum, Wendy and Mark Pfeiffer, and viewers like you. At some point, we've all needed to be in 2 places at the same time. But check this out. Today, I'm in 4 places at the same time. That's right, I'm at the Four Corners Monument, where Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah intersect. It's the only place in the entire country where this happens. We're here because this is the region where the people known as the ancestral Puebloans lived and thrived until about 800 years ago. On this episode of Hitting the Road, we'll explore the rise of their civilization and their sudden disappearance from these dwellings. You could say their disappearance is one of the greatest cliffhangers of all time.
I'm hitting the road again. Got adventure crawling under my skin. Going places that I've never been. I'm hitting the road. I'm hitting the road again. Gonna take along all of my friends. Living life like there's just no end. I'm hitting the road. Feeling better since I don't know when. I'm hitting the road.
On this episode of Hitting the Road, we begin our journey at the Poe Museum and Cultural Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and meet an artist who tells the story of the ancestral Puebloan people with her exquisite sculptures. From there, we'll visit the Puye Cliff Dwellings in Espanola, New Mexico, and Bandelier National Monument to learn more about what life was like for this ancient civilization. We'll stop by and hear from archaeologists from the University of Colorado at Boulder and Colorado Springs and learn what they've dug up in their research. Our next stop is at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center in southwestern Colorado, where we'll uncover some interesting facts about life here before things got a little rocky. Our final stop on this trek is at the crown jewel of archaeological sites for the ancestral Puebloans. We'll look back at the lives of these enigmatic people and the mysteries they left behind and see how their traditions are being kept alive today. The ancient civilization of Native Americans who inhabited the southwest region of the U.S. and northern Mexico were nomadic hunter-gatherers. It wasn't until the development of agriculture that these people were able to move away from that lifestyle and settle into what is now the Four Corners region. These people then became known as the ancestral or ancient Puebloans. Come along with us as artist Roxanne Swensel and a team of archaeologists and anthropologists take us on a trek through time to explore this fascinating culture and see how its customs and traditions live on to this very day.
This is a journey of because it's a story, it's also a journey, and so you'll see the footsteps that travel through the diorama, and the water that runs through it too is also a continuous journey. We see things not only in this journey of us, but also in seasons. Like we've gone through seasons, even in our long story. So we come from the dark and we came into the light, but it was at the beginning, which is for us the winter time. Things aren't quite coming alive yet. We're still in the caves. We're hunter-gatherers, so we're doing a lot of hunting game and living in caves and nurturing ourselves slowly from there.
Well, I think the most distant ancestors of Pueblo people were the hunting and gathering people that lived in North America before corn became a part of their life. Corn or maize is a grass that grows wild in southern Mexico. And about 6,000 years or so ago, the people that lived in southern Mexico began to control the reproduction of that particular grass.
The overall time frame for the ancestral Puebloans in that Four Corners region, they moved in during the basket maker period, and they lived in these very large pit house villages. You would get 80 pit houses in a village. I mean, they're big. Then they sort of disbanded, and their culture shifted a bit, and they moved from using baskets primarily for things like water, gathering water, cooking, storage, to making pottery. And that's when the Puebloan periods start. And there's the Pueblo I, Pueblo II, and Pueblo III periods within that. So the cliff dwellings didn't actually happen until the very end, when you get into the Puebloan III period, and it's also sort of at the middle to end of the Pueblo III period.
The earliest sites from Mesa Verde date to around 550 AD, so people were moving onto the mesa at that time. There probably were ancestral Puebloan people in the area around us before that time. However, the sites that people come to Mesa Verde to see mostly date from around AD 900 until about AD 1250, especially the cliff dwellings that were built late in that time.
And as we travel, we end up coming into the springtime of our story. The water is still traveling with us, and we start to emerge out of the earth, out of the caves, into the pit houses of our time, and we began to farm. We're still hunters and gatherers, but we're also began farming, and with farming becomes a very important need for the rain.
So what was their diet like? What were they growing?
The main food crops that they grew were corn and beans and squash, and so those were big parts of their diet. There's some thinking that as time progressed, corn became a bigger and bigger part of their diet. They also hunted, so they had plenty of meat, especially in early years. Rabbits, mule deer, the same mammals that we see today would have been here at that time. And they collected wild foods as well. And quite a few of the plants in this area have some edible or maybe a medicinal use or even a use in fabricating clothing or tools. So they certainly were masters of their environment. They knew how to take advantage of every resource, and they certainly did.
The Puebloan people were agriculturalists, and they practiced in the Four Corners area dry farming, which meant that they would plant their corn, beans, and squash, and then they would rely on the summer rainfall to irrigate those crops for them. They would have sort of water catchment and diversion tactics, but for the most part they relied on the monsoon season to keep their crops watered.
Over here you see the little corn coming up. The child is telling the grandpa to look up because the clouds are coming. The fisherman is up there in the lakes catching fish. The women are in the pit houses with children and doing their daily stuff around.
Ancient Pueblo people were agriculturalists, and we think trying to grow corn and beans and squash in a desert is tough, and it's not easy, but these people were not living a hand-to-mouth existence. It was not precarious. So you couldn't build a thing like Chaco Canyon, or you couldn't do the magnificent artwork that they did if you're just worried about where your next meal is coming from.
This is the Renaissance time of our story, and in this time the building abilities had exploded into these amazing villages that were not just for survival but had very complicated religious, social structures to them.
Well, I think that living in a cliff dwelling would actually have been very difficult because most of your resources are up on the mesa top or down in the valley. And so you would have to transport everything that you needed, all of your food. Some of the cliff dwellings did have water sources, and that a lot of the rock material within the cliff was porous, and so you would get water seepage down, and you could create little water catchment areas. Most of the rest of your resources and probably the bulk of your water had to be transported in. So you either had to climb up to do your gardening or down to do your hunting, or up to do your hunting. But either way, you were going up and down the side of the cliff on a regular basis.
I don't know how far you have to go to bring home your groceries, but the ancient Puebloans would have to travel all the way up to the top of the mesa or the canyons to hunt for their dinner. That gives bringing home the bacon a whole new meaning.
The reason why all this matters is because across the globe at different time periods, there's this transition from hunting and gathering to farming, and we call it the Neolithic demographic transition. It causes an explosion in population of people, and because of that explosion in population, they have to start organizing themselves distinctly in very social groups and understanding how social rules and things like that may start to apply to a larger population. And so that's what's happening right here in the Mesa Verde region at this time period, is that we have that switch from hunting and gathering to farming, and what we can do as archaeologists is put our anthropological hats on and start to compare what's happening here in southwestern Colorado to other places across the globe at different time periods and ask ourselves, does this look similar? Is it happening in similar ways? Are people organizing themselves in similar ways?
The ancient Puebloans were somewhat different than modern Pueblo people in that they experimented with central governments. In the 11th and 12th century at Chaco Canyon, they had something that was an awful lot like a capital city and a central government, not highly centralized. I mean, it wasn't like a Stalin's Russia or something, but there actually was a political system, a society that covered the whole Pueblo area. Today, each Pueblo is an independent town. The modern Pueblos, they're still with us. They're descendants of these people. Each town is independent. There is no one town in the middle that's in charge of things. And in the 11th, 12th centuries, they experimented with that kind of government, and they decided they didn't like it. backed away from it. Yeah, they voted with their feet, backed away from it. So.
And here we can see examples of the pottery making was exquisite. The weaving, basketry, music, the skills of just survival had become not just at a base level, but gone to a level where it was beautiful. Like the stuff that are found archaeologically are incredible. The craftsmanship is intense.
Tell me about the art of their culture.
What we call art probably was as much messaging. We are very fond of, rightfully so, I mean, we value ancient Pueblo pottery, for example. We really like those designs. And surely there's great art there, but there's also messages that we can't read at this point.
Messages in the pottery?
Yeah, I don't mean a message like a story or something you could decode, but the designs stand for things. They mean something. They mean I belong to this clan, or I belong to this village, or we'll help make it rain, or something like that. Sure, they're artistic people, and I'm sure there's a lot of free art too. But a Pueblo potter back then is making something to be used and to help the community work.
One of the things the archaeological record makes really clear is that they were extremely gifted artists, especially in pottery and jewelry making. And when you look at the numbers of pots and potsherds that are found in any site, you realize that people here were making pottery all the time. That was something that they very, very actively pursued.
The ancestral Puebloans made beautiful ceramics, and they're very well known for their ceramics. There's very iconic black on white style that they have. But not just the beautiful painted pottery, but also looking at the utilitarian wear, because you can tell a lot from ceramics. You can study the way that they made the ceramics, to look at sort of who they were studying with and how they learned how to make them. But you can also look at the clay and the temper that they use in the ceramics to find out who they're trading with or where they came from. So you can look at sort of how they move around the landscape.
Was there much trade of goods, food, and culture between the dwellings from the Four Corners area all the way down to what's now Mexico?
During Chaco's era, which immediately precedes the cliff dwellings, there was a lot of traffic. I mean, the lords of Chaco, the nobles of Chaco, were drinking cacao, chocolate, which is it's a tropical thing that only the nobles drank in Mesoamerica. They have macaws, these beautiful birds that they keep for their plumage, because feathers are an index of rank. Copper bells, things like that. A lot of turquoise is going south. That's Chaco. When Chaco falls apart, and at the end of the 11th century, and people wind up moving into the cliff dwellings, they actually become more isolated. They're still trading amongst themselves, but you see far less of the southern things, the Mesoamerican things, in the cliff dwellings. And it's an index, I think, of a society that's failing. That's, the wheels have come off, it's fallen apart. You know, all those long-distance trade connections that were so important in the 11th and 12th centuries, they're probably still really important, but they're not working.
What was their belief system like?
I can't tell you a lot about their beliefs. It's from the archaeological record reveals that they had a rich ceremonial life. What that entailed is very difficult to say. Again, scholars will go back to modern Pueblo people to try and learn a little bit about how ancient people, what their belief systems might have been based on what modern Pueblo people say. But that's supposition, and for many of the Pueblo people, that's very private information. One of the things about their belief system that is important to keep in mind is that it was as personal to them as it is to any one person today and any community today. And so although it's difficult to sort out what the details were, we know that it was something that was crucial in the life of the community and something that we should respect.
A Pueblo person would be a far better person to ask about their religious beliefs, and they probably wouldn't tell you, because Pueblo people are, secret is the wrong word. They just, you know, they don't think other people need to know. As an archaeologist, I can say that those beliefs changed. I mean, I don't know in precisely what ways, but I know that the iconography, I mean, the symbols and things, change radically from time period to time period, and the architecture that we would associate with religion changes a lot from time period to time period, and you can see this over the long haul. Pueblos hold themselves together today through their religious institutions and through their kinship and all that sort of thing. And their governments, as we would define governments, are the bare minimum. I mean, you have to have people decide how to dig a ditch and who's going to have this land, who's going to have that land, but they're really stripped back, and what holds the community together is those religious beliefs and those associations that you belong to different societies.
Why do you think they built into the alcoves?
That's a question that archaeologists ask themselves and ask the researchers to look into all the time, because it's not clear what caused them to move down into the alcoves. There is evidence that people, even early people up here, settled in the alcoves at times. There are sites from the basket maker era, which is one of the early eras, in some of the alcoves. But it seems clear that later in time, there was a really big movement of population off of the mesa tops down into the alcoves. And what caused that is one of the big mysteries of this story, of the ancestral Puebloan story.
There are debates among archaeologists as to why they were living in the cliffs here. Probably the most compelling argument is that these south-facing cliffs are considerably warmer and have more hours of sunlight during the wintertime. And here in the southwest, of course, the temperature goes down markedly the minute the sun goes below the horizon. And here in Frijoles Canyon in December and January, that often happens about 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon. But if you're up on the cliff 100 feet higher, you get another hour or so of extra sunlight. Plus the cliff faces are radiating the sunlight, and so it's actually much warmer up there.
So there's a lot of theories about why they moved into the cliffs, into the cliff dwellings. And most of them revolve around conflict in the area at the time. So there were sort of two strategies to deal with some of the conflict that was happening within the region. And one was to build sort of fortified villages at the top on the mesas of the cliffs, so you're overlooking the valley, and then behind you is a wall, so that people can't sneak up on you from either direction.
And you can see who's coming at you.
You can see who's coming up the valley very easily. And the other then was to move down off the top of the mesa into the cliffs below and create your villages down there, which made you very well protected. It was not easy. You could not easily climb up the cliff face to attack the village, and it wasn't as easy to come down over the top as well. So they were defensive strategies. They moved into there at the end because of the amount of conflict that was going on in the region at the time. Now, why there was conflict, we don't really know. There are theories that they were competing for resources that were scarce there, maybe because of overpopulation, maybe because of drought, maybe just because this society was not set up well to handle the number of people that were living together. We're not really sure why there was that conflict, but we can see the result of that in the cliff dwellings and in the fortified villages that you see that happened at the end of the Pueblo III period.
When did the ancestral Puebloans leave?
It looks like they left sometime in the 1200s, and that's the end of the period that we talked about a little earlier when people were moving into the alcoves. So in the 1100s, there was this flurry of construction when people moved down into the alcove sites, built these fairly complicated communities like Spruce Tree House and Balcony House and Cliff Palace. And 100 years later, it looks as if they were leaving those communities. And not only the alcove communities, but the sites up here on the mesa as well. Most archaeologists think that by about AD 1300, there were very few people left in the whole area, and that most of the ancestral Pueblo people had headed south or southeast at that point.
The ancestral Puebloan probably lived in the cliff dwellings in the actual cliffs, for maybe 80 years total. It was a very short period of time at the end of the Pueblo III period, right before they abandoned the area.
How long did it take from the peak of the population to the end of the era?
People start leaving, out-migrating in village-sized groups, about 12, 20. And the times are still good. It's still raining, which is the main thing, that they can grow corn. It's still reasonably peaceful, but people start bailing out. And the wheels are coming off in terms of their political system and their social system. And more people leave, and by 1275, they're mostly gone. By 1300, they're gone. And from 1275 to 1300 is a drought, which it's more the exclamation point on the end of it. They started leaving long before that.
The more recent research makes it look as if there was a real combination of events that came together to encourage people to start moving south. One of those events probably was prolonged drought. The tree ring record shows that there was a long period of exceptionally dry years in the late 1200s, and that certainly would have had an impact on people who made their living by farming. It also looks like population had been growing, and there's some evidence that there was friction between communities. And so for some people, some communities, that friction coupled with drought might have started to make it seem like there might be greener pastures elsewhere.
For a long time, archaeologists have speculated that the primary cause of the abandonment of all the cliff dwellings was a drought that started in 1276. And went for almost 25 years. And archaeologists know this because we've figured out how to reconstruct weather patterns by studying the annual growth rings of trees that were chopped down in the past to build Pueblo houses and that we now find in archaeological sites. So for the longest time, archaeologists thought that this drought was the primary cause of the abandonment. But what we found from looking more closely at that question is that Pueblo people had weathered much worse droughts in earlier stages of their history that did not lead to the widespread collapse of the society. So it doesn't seem as though climate by itself can explain what happened. It seems like it must be some combination of climate and the way people respond to changes in climate in the particular context that they happen to be in at that moment. There is evidence that there were problems with the weather, that would have made it harder to farm. There's also evidence that Pueblo people had depleted some of the resources they depended on in the area where they lived. There's also evidence for a lot of social conflict during this period of time, a lot of violence, either interpersonal, but also sometimes village violence. And there's emerging evidence that perhaps other non-Pueblo people or other peoples were starting to appear in the area during the same period of time. So there might have been social conflicts involving people from different tribal communities. What we generally think is that all of those factors interacted with each other and kind of added up together to produce what happened. But what we still don't have a very good handle on is how exactly, the sudden migration of many thousands of people actually happened. How did it play out socially? How did a large and thriving society of people become convinced that the best thing to do was to leave a home that they had been developing for many centuries.
The ancestral Puebloans lived a rocky existence, but they were innovative in developing agriculture and passive solar architecture. So it does appear that it was a combination of drought, dwindling resources, and overpopulation that forced them to leave their homes in the cliff dwellings.
For me, it's important to remember who you are, because those are the things that make you who you are, because all of those steps that my ancestors took made it such that I'm here today, and that then the more I know about where I came from, the more I can then hand what I think is valuable about that to the next generation. If we don't respect our environment, if we don't respect what made us be here, we will discontinue. It'll end.
We'll just all be lost.
Yeah.
I'm hitting the road again. Got adventure crawling under my skin. Going places that I've never been. I'm hitting the road. I'm hitting the road again. Gonna take along all my friends. Living life like there's just no end. I'm hitting the road. Feeling better since I don't know when.
Hitting the Road is proudly sponsored by...
Some bears spend a lot of time preparing their dens for winter. Others just unpack, settle in, and snooze. Learn more about Sleepy Bear's story at travellodge.com.
As well as contributions from G.E. Johnson Construction Company, Charles J. Murphy, Gray Line of Colorado, Laura and Brian Markovich, Elham and Edward Ketchum, Wendy and Mark Pfeiffer, and viewers like you.